Thanks very much. And as Mary Coughlin said, this is my first time, at least speaking here, not in Glenties, but my first time at the summer school. I'll keep it as quick or as well as I can to the 15 minutes. No slides here, so it's just a talk, a sort of a prepared talk. I've lived beside, as Mary Coughlin has just said there, I'm from County Down. I've lived beside the border for most of my life, and my work both in Intertrade Ireland and now in the Ulster University has allowed me probably plenty of time to think and read and sort of write on the subject of cross-border cooperation and the border region economy more generally. And in a sense, what I wanted to do this morning was start by going back to where it almost all begins, really, with the border, out of a history background. And I think to go back to March 1925 is maybe a good place to think about this shortly after the partitioning of the island. And in that month, the Boundary Commission began to take oral evidence right across the border, toured from one side of the border region to the other to hear people and to get people to come and make their views known on where the border should be, what was life like in that region, if there were to be changes to the border, what should those be, what should be included in the Irish Free State, what should be included in the new state of Northern Ireland at that stage. And that was the beginning of the Boundary Commission, is that it met more than 500 people, mostly men, it has to be said, politicians, farmers, businessmen, landowners and so on. And the evidence gathering carried on from March through to July. And the oral archive that's there from that, the transcripts from it, make a fascinating view of what life was like in the border region at that time. And it probably, I suppose, most pertinent to the Brexit question is what was life like at a time when things had just changed. The border had come in. This was a border, nobody knew how long it would last, how hard the border would be, how soft the border might be between the two parts of the island, and also what it might mean for day-to-day life. The life that you farmed on one side of the border, or on both sides of the border in some cases. You did business on either side of the border. People were grappling with very great uncertainty at that time. Few women, as I said, gave evidence, but there were some exceptions, both from Donegal, some of them from Donegal, a Lydia Cunningham from Lisfannon and a Mrs Wilson from Raphoe. Their complaints might seem to us rather mundane, but in a sense their complaints were around the fact that what was to happen to them if they couldn't get access to the fashions that were in Derry City. That might seem mundane, but that was the issue in those days. Maybe MacGill wasn't on the go at that point in Ballybuffet. Another woman, actually my grandmother, Nana Wakin, signed a declaration of why she wouldn't make representation to the Commission, saying that she didn't recognise the border, therefore she wouldn't appear in front of it. She wrote to Eoin MacNeill, who was the Irish Commissioner on the Boundary Commission, reminding him that he had met her in Omeath when she was a young girl, in his days in the Conora at that stage, and saying that how he must prevent a border running through the kingdom or the lordship of Oriel, where she lived. So in a sense, people had a sense of space and a sense of time around the border that in ways, the border in some ways, in some places, seemed to cut through what were natural hinterlands for people. And I think that's, in a sense, what people are concerned about with Brexit. We've been doing some research, been lucky. Derry City and Strabane and Donegal County Council had asked us to do work in the northwest, and subsequently have been working with councils right across the border corridor in looking at what the impacts might be of Brexit on the region as a whole. And it's fair to say, I think, when you look at the border region, and this will come to no surprise as many who either live here or attend the summer school, our findings would support, in a sense, what John Bradley and Michael Best called a couple of years ago, that the border region is a bypassed place in many ways. There are some very good examples of successful businesses in the border. You can think of Gallagher's over in Ardara, Combi-Lift in County Monaghan, and numbers of others, but there are too few of these examples, and in a sense there are too few of people who are being able to entrepreneurship's very high in the border counties right across both sides, and yet we still have some of the lowest levels of productivity on either side of the border there. So there are issues there that are already there before Brexit comes along. I think there's the other issue, I think, there to think about when you're thinking about Brexit is not only the low productivity and the economic challenges that exist, but also the fact that over the last 20 years or so, both councils and others, with a lot of support from the European Union, have built up greater codependencies. Those codependencies were always there. As I say, if you go back to the Boundary Commission in the 1920s, those codependencies are clear. The fact that people travel back and forward across the border on a daily basis. Maybe much less in the era of the Troubles, much less in the era when back-to-back development set in. But in the last 20 years, a lot of those relationships have been rebuilt. You look at, in your area here, you look at the work that Derry City and Strabane and Donegal County Councils have been doing, and that's a superb exemplar of work that can be done. Over in my area, Louth and Newry Morning Down have a memorandum of understanding between the two councils on things like emergency planning and so on. So there's a lot of work that has been done there to build up those relationships again and those codependencies, as you might call them. And I think people are worried now that Brexit will set those back. They're around a number of issues, and I'll touch on a few of these just briefly. If you think trade, the agri-food sector in particular, inward investment or FDI being another, what you might call migration or the freedom of people to move back and forward across the border, and then briefly, one that's well known to people, the threat that there is there to EU funding. If you take trade, the flows and so on are well known at this stage, about 3 billion in goods, maybe the same again in services. But I think what's less known is the fact of how well concentrated that is in a number of sectors, agri-food being well known as a good example. But also I think the dependence in an area like this is much higher on cross-border trade, the dependence of businesses than it would be elsewhere on the island. Distance matters when you're doing trade. You tend to do trade on a shorter distance, so your nearest market is your key market. And anything I think that threatens that, particularly for the smaller businesses in and around the border region, would be a kind of a critical change to that. We think, when we think of whether the UK will leave not only the single market but the customs union, we need to think then about what sort of a border comes in. A customs border is not just one with tariffs, it has all the other non-tariff barriers, as economists might call them, in and around regulation, in and around standards, in and around safety of products. I think anyone who talks about a seamless or frictionless border and clearance being able to be done is not thinking about the operation of the border as it is here. Most of the freight is not done through large operators. Most of the freight is done through somebody like a local food company throw the stuff in the back of their chilled van and take that off. It's done by the businesses themselves. The issues around kind of clearance and pre-clearance, whether that be done at the border or 50 miles away, then becomes a problem for companies, a cost for companies, and it may be easier not to do that cross-border trade. There are other, if you take a sector like agri-food, it's particularly a threat because of the fact that it's so integrated. We're not talking trade here as much as different parts of the same business taking product and putting it back and forward. Milk, in a sense, when people ask me how does this work, milk runs downhill, goes from north to south. Meat tends to go uphill, and that's the way it seems to be working. But it's incredibly highly integrated, those businesses, and to think, in a sense, what has to be done there to deal with that is going to be a key issue. If you take it, what it means on a day-to-day basis, not just the businesses. Manufacturing, very, very, very important on either side of the border in terms of the region there. Around about 20% of manufacturing employees working in the agri-food in that sector, and that's not accounting for the fact of the basic agriculture and the fact that most of the milk is being collected from, obviously, from farms, so their dependence on those kind of supply chains as well. Movement of people, same sort of issue. An awful lot of this taken for granted because of the softness of the border, particularly over the last 20 years. Some reckon, if you look at the road counters that the Department for Infrastructure in the north have, perhaps up to 300,000 crossings per day. A lot of that freight, which goes back to the point I made there earlier about how you would actually manage that. Some, perhaps 20,000 of that by HGVs of those 300,000 crossings. So that was in 2015. Those figures have been fairly steady at that rate for the last 5-6 years. That, in a sense, doesn't count the fact that if you're thinking now of the recovery in the southern economy, the recovery in construction, and what that then means for construction workers from the north heading across the border, sometimes daily, sometimes on a weekly basis, and the impact that will have there as well. So the movement of people on a cross-border basis is one thing. The question and the uncertainty then over the movement of people coming from elsewhere to live here is another issue. If we, from the work we've looked at, the border region on either side would have higher kind of percentages of its population of people who have come and applied then for PPSN numbers or national insurance numbers in the northern side. So there's a high dependence of local industry on labour from elsewhere in Europe, and the uncertainty that sets in there. Actually, in the northern side, how that's kind of worked itself out in the recent time is the fact that sterling has fallen has meant that some companies are finding it difficult to hold on to that labour, because in a sense, if you're sending some of that money home to Euroland, you may as well earn it in euro and send it home in that way, as opposed to send it in sterling and losing the money that you're losing there, the 10 or 15% that you might be losing. So there are issues already. That's even before the negotiations seriously get underway. FDI, I leave because in a sense, I don't think the FDI is very important in some parts of the border region, less so in others. People talk about opportunities there, and there may well be that. I think if you're in centres where financial services are concentrated, there may well be opportunities there for what might come out of the southeast of England. There may be other opportunities if you're on the northern side in terms of companies coming to locate there to access the UK market if a hard border comes in. So there may be opportunities there. However, I think if you look at the border region in general, the issue is not around just attracting FDI. I go back to the point I made there at the start. It's probably getting more companies of the likes of Gallagher's, of Combi-Lift and others for those companies to flourish, and it'll be concentrating on that, which I don't think we've been as good as attracting in FDI. EU funding, well, in the nature of those funds, it's not possible to predict what the counties might get over the next years, but I think some certainty around that. One time, I think when we think about EU funds, probably the key one on the northern side to remember here is CAP. Northern Ireland calculates it'll get 3.5 billion up to 2020. 70% of that will be from the Common Agricultural Policy, and replacing that, I think, will be an important part of the discussions going on. And the nature of what a Northern Ireland or a UK agricultural policy, I think, is an important one. So the outcomes then, one of the things we were asked to do was to look at that. And I think when you look at it, economists and forecasts, well, it's a bit of a mixed bag when you look at that. But taking that as a caveat, when we've looked at this, Brexit, well managed, if you like, will have an impact. Brexit, poorly managed, will have a disastrous impact, and particularly on this region. And I think that can come down to itself in terms of employment. For the southern side will continue to grow in terms of employment over the next 10 years, even under a badly managed Brexit, but at half, if not a third of the rate that it would do if the baseline was followed as it is. On the northern side, a badly managed Brexit then starts to mean job losses in an economy that's already, as I say, lagging behind the rest of Northern Ireland, which itself is lagging behind the rest of the UK regions too. So in conclusion, that's a quick cook's tour really of what the impacts or the areas to watch out for might be. If you return to where I began, back in the 1920s, when the Irish border was a fairly youthful creation at that stage, and as I say, no one knew how long it would last. The decisions about the region then as now were made far away from places like here, and I suppose this is a reminder, although as we can, even though we get as ready as we possibly can be for the changes coming or that might come in this region, there are things that we'll need others to do, and we'll need to argue for that. And then to ensure this happens, I think we need to be very clear. Any of the meetings that I've been at where Irish government or other ministers or civil servants have been at, they ask, what they're saying is that we need to be very clear about what we're asking for. And I think when you go back to the point I made at the start, the two things about the border region that makes it unique in its way but also uniquely exposed to risk from Brexit are, first of all, the kind of fairly lagging nature of the economy in the border region. So doing things around that to kind of address that in areas such as skills, in a particular area such as infrastructure, and in other areas there in terms of supporting businesses to actually move, if they're doing cross-border trade, to move beyond that, to move into other markets and so on. I think those things are going to be key there in terms of the competitiveness and the productivity in it. And I would say infrastructure is very important in that. I think the arguments here about the roads going to both Donegal and Derry are crucial, I think, in that discussion. Broadband and the kind of patchy nature of that as well right across the border region is another issue. We think about that as for businesses. I think it's just as important if there are young people in the area in terms of retention of young people and skilled people. The roads will retain people. It's not like people can kind of move around and be more mobile to that, but broadband is the thing that will keep young people in an area as opposed to the lack of that. I think if anybody who has teenage children or even younger now sees them in the house without broadband, it's like, all the lights have been switched off. So I think thinking about that is something that we need to be very serious about. There are things there are things we can't know or be clear about. We don't know what exit door the UK government will choose or will be offered, I suppose, as well. And before the election, it seemed quite clear the UK will leave the customs union. Now that's probably not as definite, although that's still the official line. Nor can we be sure what bespoke, special or unique arrangements, if any, will be made for the border region for Northern Ireland as well, or for the island of Ireland as a whole. These arrangements seem to be further up the agenda than might have been expected, but the questions of how hard the border will be or where it might be located remain open ones, and I think ones that should be for discussion. Two things do seem to me to be clear. First of all, I'd agree with Cliff Taylor in the Irish Times when he wrote recently that the idea of a post-Brexit frictionless border is pure fantasy. Technology won't do it. I think the only way of doing that, and this is probably the crux of the issue, if the UK decides to leave the customs union, then there is a question of where that hard border will be. Will it be across the island, or will it be down the sea between the island of Ireland and the rest and GB? And that, I think, is a critical point. And second, the point I would make in terms of clarity here is that while the Irish government has done very, very well in terms of raising the unique circumstances of the island right up the agenda, that is going to be a difficult thing, to keep, or a difficult thing to keep at the top table. I don't think we should underestimate the difficulties around that. I think the politics of the border then, as in the 1920s as now, are messy ones, given the lived lives of people around there. So we'll need to deal primarily really with the ensuring movement of people, ensuring movement of goods and services. I'll give you one example of that. If you think of an accountancy firm in this area or right across the border region, they would estimate that 30% of their staff cross the border every day to come to work and 50% of their clients. So we're not just talking about goods moving here, we're talking about professional services and other things like that. Direction, I think, will need to be a central part of what is going to be done for the border region. The national planning framework becomes critical in that, and the directions that are given in that around things like infrastructure, but also around other issues around mitigating the impact of Brexit on the border region. And in a sense, the question I would ask, if we're moving into a new era for the border and for border politics, there are questions there. Should we hold on to what we have? Is that the objective? In a sense, yes, I can understand that, we look for some sort of special status that keeps things as they are. In a sense, do we take a leap into doing something different for the border region in terms of better, in terms of maybe in a sense not just paying lip service to regional development, but actually doing something about that? Is that the other thing? Or do we just sit on our hands and hope for the best? I would pick the second of those options. I think that has got to be key. Brexit and the Brexit debate may actually pose an opportunity for this area to, in a sense, now that it's well up the agenda, to start and look to say, right, what would balanced regional development on the island of Ireland actually look like? And where do places like Glanties or my area around Warrenpoint and County Down, where do those fit within that picture, and what can be done not only to sort of mitigate Brexit, but to actually bring those areas up to where the rest of the island is at? I'll leave it at that. Thank you very much.